Bonne année tout le monde. Ein frohes neues Jahr allen Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörern. Happy New Year. This is a very special start into the new year. So last year in August, in the heat of the summer, President Macron and Chancellor Merz announced the Franco-German economic agenda. And so we thought with our friends from the French embassy in Germany and the ERB that, well, even in particular in the cold winter months, it's important to keep it warm and instill life into it. So this is what I hope is a first in a series of events on this agenda. And we start with a subject that is on everybody's mind in France, Germany, and other countries where populations are aging, and that is pensions. And so first, my colleague Hervé Bouliol will give us an introduction into what the OECD has to say about pensions and work in the best years in France and Germany and other OECD countries. And then I will introduce you to my brilliant panel that includes experts from the Franco-German Council of Economic Experts, from the embassy. You'll see it, but a little bit later. For now, Hervé, the screen is yours, and we're looking forward to what you can tell us about pensions in France and Germany.
Hello, everyone. So I'm now need to share, but I don't see. Okay, yes, I'll share my screen. 1 second. Oops. Where is it? With the recording stuff, okay, yes, I can see it here now. Yes, sorry for that. It's fine, right? You see it?
Perfect. Go.
Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Nicola, for organizing this workshop about comparing France and Germany and how they deal with the common challenges triggered by population aging in the labor market and pension areas. Actually, I right away, yes, common challenges. All OECD countries, to some extent, face population aging and the challenges of population aging. But it's important to highlight that the extent, though, of aging is, in fact, very different across countries, different starting points, different dynamics. And usually Germany is considered as aging fast and much faster than France, which we'll see is true to some extent, but I will start by qualifying this. We'll see that in 1 minute. But before the outline, so the presentation, which rather focuses on pensions, aims to set the scene for what promises to be a rich discussion afterwards. So the outline is the following. First, despite much lower fertility rates than in France over the last 75 years at least, when we have good data, the impact so far on the pace of aging has been cushioned in Germany, and which is a bit of a puzzle. I'll come back to that. However, aging pressure is projected to be stronger in the next 25 years in Germany. Not surprisingly, I will show a document that there remains a wide margin to raise the employment of older workers in France, and that pension policies are essential to boost employment at older ages. They cannot do everything, of course. There should be many accompanying measures, especially in the area of labor market, but pension policies remain essential in that area. And I will highlight that differences in the key pension parameters between France and Germany reflect different policy priorities more so than different aging prospects. So I'll start here and focusing on the left panel. So here what you see is the change in the working age population. So working age population is defined as those between age 20 and 64. So left panel is the change since 1980. And you can see that all the countries there, the first thing you see is positive numbers. That means that population, working age population, demographic dynamics have been a supporting factor for economic growth. And so that's the first thing, positive numbers. Second, if you look at the two extreme bars, you see my mouse right here. So you see in the EU, it was plus 13%. In the US, it was much bigger, of course, plus 53%. So demographic was much stronger, had a much stronger impact on economic growth in the US than in Europe. And within Europe, so I put France and Germany, significant difference, plus 8% in Germany, plus 22% in France. And here there are two things. Of course, this reflects differences, not only, but mainly differences in past fertility rates. On average, since, say, 1950, fertility rates have been, total fertility rates have been 0.4 percentage points above in France, higher in France than in Germany. And in Germany, since 1970, it's rather close to 1.5, certainly much below what is population replacement level. So fertility rates is probably should have led already to a fall in the working age population. This means, and this is the title of this slide, that to a large extent, migration inflows have so far limited downward pressure on the working age population in Germany. And when we look deeper, we were actually quite, that's the first time, honestly, I looked deeply into this for this presentation. I was quite surprised because since 1980, the net inflows per year on average, very volatile in Germany for different reasons, but net inflows per year is 3 to 4 times bigger than in France. So that's quite impressive. And even maybe, I don't know, more surprisingly, but as surprisingly, relative, it's even much bigger than in the UK, even when we adjust for the difference in the size of the population, total population. So this was kind of a surprise. And this limit, again, what would have been driven by low fertility, to make it short. However, when we look at the next 45 years, based on projections, so many uncertainty related to these projections, you see that all the numbers are going down quite a lot. In the US, it's still positive, but in the European Union, demographic will be a drag to economic growth. And in Germany, you see quite significant one, minus 22% over the next 45 years. So plus here, minus here, this means that the impact on the change in the growth potential is very significant. When we go to here, the old age to working age ratio, which is, as you know, one key demographic indicator to account for aging pressure in the assessment of the financial sustainability of pay-go systems, like in France and Germany. What you see here is basically at the beginning of the period, and it's better probably to start in 1990, the ratio was similar in both countries. Here, there has been starting to diverge at the beginning of the century in 2002, 3, whatever. And so starting to diverge, but then there was a huge migration after 2010, which brings back Germany towards the France level. So we are at basically 40 now. So 40 means 40 people of age 65 plus for 100 person of age 2064. So what you see overall, there is this wave here, but overall, we started by the same level and we are now about at the same level. And if you remember the past chart, this is despite the fact that the denominator here, the working age, has increased much less in Germany than France. So second, a bit of a surprise. So this means mathematically that the numerator has an effect, and we indeed looked at it. And since 95 at least, the number of people aged 65 plus increased much faster in France than Germany. So much more older people in France, plus 71% over the last 30 years, compared to plus 58% in Germany. So this bigger increase in the number of older people offset the lower growth of the working age population in Germany. And I didn't have time to look in the details, but it's related here to very old past fertility rates, which translate into the number of older people. And there might be some war effects, but again, it's conjecture at this point. When we look at the future, though, so we start by at the same level, about 40 here. When we look at 2070, you're basically close to a bit below 60 in Germany, close to 50 in France, a bit above. So this means that basically, based on that metric, aging now is projected to be twice faster in Germany than France, based on this indicator. But when we look at other European countries, so you see here the EU average, again, based on that metric, it started at the beginning of the period as EU was kind of much younger based on that metric, but it's aging very fast, reaching actually German levels in 2016, the projections, due to very fast aging in Southern European countries, in Central and Eastern European countries. I just put here Italy, that's just to illustrate, but Spain will gives typically even faster aging, Greece, Portugal, but also so Central Eastern Europe, Poland, Baltic countries, and so forth. And what is interesting also is UK, because UK, thanks to inwards migration, is limiting until for the next decades the pace of aging. But after the impact of the baby boom in France there, it will converge basically to France level despite this high migration. So turning to employment, you see here France compared to OECD average, first focusing on 55, 59. So the performance of France in employment of the 55, 59, we tend to be, and I'm in the group, to be overly pessimistic about France. This area is France as a great performance. So it's worth highlighting it. 55, 59, it started from fairly low level, yes, in 1990, say 10 points below the OECD average. And since over the last 15 years, it crossed the line, it's similar levels, but a little bit above. So 55, 59 is, I would say, quite impressive. For the 60, 64, we have the same pattern in the sense of turnaround. In 2000, huge increase again for France. It's tripling from 10% to 30% now. So it's a big improvement, but it has also been the case in most countries, OECD average. And the gap, that's what is important here, remains quite big. There has been some catching up because the difference in percentage point here has now, I think 1/3 of it has been eliminated now, so 1/3, but the gap remains quite huge. And when we look at the breakdown by sex, so here you have the same charts, but men and women are showed differently. So you have the bolded line for France and the clear lines for OECD average, and solid for men and dotted line for women. So so you see the gap, same pattern, of course, we just break down by gender, but what is striking, and that's where pension policies play a key role, is France, in that sense, could be said as being good in terms of gender behavior, because the employment rate is similar in France between men and women. It has been the case for the last 25 years, while in most OECD countries, there is a gap. The problem, though, is that this low gender gap in France is due, compared at least to OECD average, to huge gap for men. So men, the employment rate is very low compared to OECD for men. And that's why I'm back to pension policies, because this is mainly due to three things. First is special pension schemes that benefit men mainly. There is also long career pension schemes, also benefiting mainly men. And in France, the contribution period plays a key role to generate pension entitlements without penalty. It plays a bigger role than in many countries. And because of career breaks, especially due to childcare, women have lower contribution period in, say, middle age, and they need to work longer to get the full pension. So special pension schemes, long career schemes, the big role of contribution period means that basically the employment rate of men is low compared to what is expected in EU countries. When we look at Germany, so Germany is black here in black. There is also a big turnaround in 2000. Yes, the increase in retirement age has played a role, but I think people here in the panel are better qualified than, including Nicola, better qualified than me to comment on this. I think it's fair to say that, yes, pension policy played a role, but the main factors has been more in the labor market policies there. But you see that for female employment, the increase is very sharp. You need to take into account that it's only employment rate. This does not take into account hours worked, of course, right, where there is still a huge gap in Germany. So here I plot, on the y-axis, this employment rate, age 60, 64, and on the x-axis, normal retirement age in 2024. So here, normal retirement age is a synthetic measure. Yes, it's a key pension parameter, but it captures very partially what's going on pension systems, even in terms of age. It's synthetic, but it has many, many limitations. I don't have time to discuss this, but it's very partial. Yet, despite this limitation, I consider that the linear correlation coefficient across countries, so no causality and no nothing, just linear correlation coefficient, is remarkably high, 67%. Again, this is despite the limitation of the measure here. This is despite the fact that you see Latin American countries, here Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, where retirement age play a lesser role because of big informality in the labor market. There is also the case of Korea, because pensions are still in the making and they mean less, so to speak. So despite all these limitations, the correlation is very strong. And you see that Germany is even above what would be implied by this line. But more importantly, that France here is much below. So something that is not captured by the normal retirement age. And again, we are back to the special pension schemes, and the long career pensions, which explain part of it. And in fact, all the countries there, Italy, Greece, Poland, Austria, France, many characteristics related to pension can explain why they have such a low employment rate among the 60-64. I think for the purpose of time, I will skip this. I think I'm already a bit long, I guess. So we can come back later, maybe. I'll focus on this chart, which is based on the employment outlook published by the OECD last July. So this, in the employment outlook and in this chart, there were three stylized scenarios that were considered to assess how mobilizing untapped labor resources can help combat the decline in the working age population and in the growth rate of income per capita due to aging. So you have here the white diamond. The white diamond is what is projected. So that's over 2024, 2060. The white diamond is what is projected in terms of the employment to population loss. You have to consider it's not really employment rate in the sense that we talk about total population, right? So that's in that sense that relates more to GDP per capita, if you will. So total population, you see that OECD and France, it's projected to be 2 points lower. Employment is projected to be 2 points lower as, again, a share of total population. In Germany, it's more than twice bigger, right? So again, it shows you how, in terms of the challenge, in that sense, differ quite a bit. I don't have time to go into details of the methodology first, but anyhow, I'm not really the best person because I was not involved in this project. I just considered that it was, I decided to show that chart because I think it fits well within the discussion we will have. And you can, if you're interested, refer to chapter 2 in this employment outlook. But the main message here is that there is huge potential to offset the impact of aging, so this basically white diamond, by mobilizing especially older people in the labor market in many countries, but in particular here in France. But you said that even in the US, right, where the aging pressure is limited, you still have quite untapped labor market resources at older ages. And by the way, sorry, I forgot to say that the three scenarios that are I should have said that. The three scenarios that are shown here is first, there is raising migration rates and reducing labor market exit age at older ages towards levels in reference OECD countries. That's one thing. And also closing the gender gap in employment rate for young age, prime age, and also old age. So this old age thing is reducing the exit rates and closing the gender gap among between older men and older women, right? So, sorry, I should have mentioned that, but I don't want to go further. Anyway, huge potential, in particular in France, but not only to really offset the impact of aging on the labor market. Now, I quickly turn to illustrate, again, it's very short, simplistic in many ways, but how France and Germany how the key pension parameters reflect different policy priorities in France and Germany. And here this slide focuses on benefits. So here you have relative income of the 66 plus. It is household level, not only pensions, right? Total income, household level, 66 plus compared to the average income of total population. So France is close to 100%, 100% being average income is similar to the total population, while in the OECD on average, and Germany is 13%, 13% below, right? So it's relative income, of course, total population is 100. So if you have minus 13%, there is some offset for other age groups. And when we look deeper, we see, and that's quite impressive actually in Germany, is that for people age 51, 65, the average income in Germany is 18% above total population, right? So you have 18% above for the 51, 65, 13% below for 65 plus. In France, the other side of the coin here is that if you look at those age between 26 and 40, they have an average income that is 4% below the total population, while in the OECD, it is 4% above, right? So that's a trade-off. There is, it seems to be, at least we hope, that this reflects a choice, national preferences, that there is a political choice basically to support income of older people. Mind you, this is today, and when we look at projections, the Conseil d'orientation des retraites, the COR in France, make projections, and basically for the next decade, say 2040, 2050, this ratio is projected to decline to 90, 87, so close to OECD average today. So due to past pension reforms mainly. The good side also is that relative income poverty rate, so measure of inequality really, is among older people is much lower in France than in the OECD average. And Germany is, again, close to the OECD average. Same thing, old age safety net, so someone who has never worked, that's what the person will get, 20%, 27% of gross average earnings in France. That is called ASPA. It's not that much use, but still good protection, 27%, while the OECD average, Germany, is close to 20%. And when we look at the future, so here, just to illustrate, future replacement rate at the average wage level, here that's the 2002 birth cohorts, so people entering the labor market now, full career, and you see that the replacement rate in France, still despite all the reform, is 70%, while it is, I don't see it because of maybe I can move that 1 second. Yeah, so it's 63% in the OECD on average, so much higher in France, and it's even lower in Germany. That's mandatory pensions taken into account. It is true that, as people in the room here know, in this workshop, it's take only mandatory pensions. So private pension plays a small role, but it does not take occupational pensions. And we know that in some sectors in Germany, it's important, but it's not taken into account there. And I just put that almost for fun, but when we look at very high wages, so 6 times the average wage, that's very high wages. That's one very specific feature of France, is the replacement rate in France is quite high, 50%, 51%. So this means that these people with a full career, with this type of wages, will earn pensions that is 3 times the net average wage, right? That's huge. Much bigger than OECD average, much bigger than Germany. And this is due to one specific feature in France, is that up to 8 times the average wage, you earn good pension entitlements in France. Yes, people contribute. So nothing is free, of course. You pay contributions, but you get very high pensions in that case. The problem is that this tends to compound the effect of inequality in life expectancy, which I can discuss if you want later. But again, here in the replacement rate or in benefit level, Germany makes different choices closer to the OECD average. and even lower in terms of replacement rate for mandatory pensions. And my last two slides. So, of course, this translates into higher pension spending in France compared to Germany, whether that's current or future. This is this two line compared to Germany and compared to the OECD average, which is also associated with much higher contribution rates. So there is all this debate all the time that this higher spending could be linked to future financial sustainability pressure, but a big part of it is accounted for by higher contribution rates, while on the other hand, Germany is close to the OECD average mandatory contribution rate of 18-19%, which to some extent is quite interesting to debate, because as we have seen, Germany will face aging pressure that are much faster than the OECD average. And yet the mandatory contribution rate is only at the OECD average level. So here there is a bit of a, I don't know, tension, but point of discussion. At the same time, having said that, that's what I put here, the tax wedge, because I know this is something that is very important in Germany. Yes, mandatory contribution rate is close to OECD average, but when you look at the tax wedge, so the difference between labor cost and net wage after income taxes. So here, Germany has a tax wage which is very high, as high as in France, or even higher, much higher than OECD average. And this illustrates that there is a different financing structure of public spending, which is, I think, also worth discussing and scrutinizing. And this means that given strong focus in Germany on competitiveness, this tend to limit the margin to use the contribution rate, to use a contribution rate to deal with future aging pressure. And my last slide, because I try to highlight differences, but I want to finish with some common pension features. There are some in France and Germany. I just chose 4. Both countries differently, but took measures to reduce future pensions and raise retirement ages to deal with aging. Some, as you know, are questioned in France these days, but some measures have been taken in the past. One common feature is that both countries maintain separate pension scheme for civil servants. Not many countries now in the OECD do that. We used to depict only 4, actually, adding Belgium and South Korea to France and Germany as totally different pension schemes. Here we talk about central government. Same thing that is part of the questions debated here is the small role of private pensions in both countries. And finally, the fact that both countries use fairly long contribution periods to allow retiring earlier without penalty. Again, as I mentioned before, this contribution period plays a much bigger role in France than in Germany, but still, to retire earlier with 43 years in the future in France, 45 years in Germany, I want to highlight that in the OECD, not many countries use the contribution period, maybe 7, 8 countries. And with 43, 45, this is among the longest. I think Portugal has 46 years, for example, but other countries are more around 40 years, say Greece, Portugal, I think I noted one, Slovenia, for example, have 40 years. Even Spain at 38, 45 in the future, so much lower. So already this means that this length of contribution period, there is probably limited margin in both countries to use this lever in the future to deal with aging pressure. And I will stop with this.
Great. Thank you very much, Hervé, for this presentation and for introducing us to the subject and showing some, similarities and differences between pension systems in France and Germany that may, some aspects really surprised me as well. So that was helpful. There are quite a bit of questions that already accumulated while you were talking in the chat, but I'm going to introduce my panel now first. I won't forget about the questions, but we'll weave them into the discussion later. And I start with, so ladies first, and also to demonstrate. So I said that was Franco-German, but Franco-German means it's for Europe, of course. So I'm very happy that we have Giulia Dopponi, a labor market expert and also pension expert from Milan, joining us. Welcome, Giulia.
Thank you, Nicola.
Jérôme Brouillet, who is from the French embassy in Germany and hence a partner for this event, but also in a prior incarnation, he not so long ago, he wrote an important report about pensions in France. So he'll have a lot to tell us. Welcome, Jérôme. And then we have two members of the Franco-German Council of Economic Experts, Antoine Bosius, joining us from Paris, and Enzo Weber from our partner IAB from Nuremberg. So very welcome to this group, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Perhaps as a start, I don't know, Giulia, because we were looking at different, you're not a demographer, but still, when I looked at Hervé's slides, I saw, he said, I was very surprised. Aging hasn't hit in Germany yet, but then in the future, it will hit a lot. And I think he also showed this for Italy. But if I remember correctly, and we can discuss that with the others, 20 years back, everybody was saying, aging is going to be a disaster in Germany and on the pension systems, on the social security systems. And then things turn out very differently and to a large degree, thanks to migration. So what do you think? Couldn't that be a scenario also for Italy, where migration is really picking up now? And I'm not saying migration is a solution to all of this, but things can turn out very differently, right? When you project demographics into the future.
Thank you, Nicola, and good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here today. So as you said, I'm not a demographer, so that's not kind of my specialty, but certainly like this kind of migration patterns can have an important role, especially I would say if, migration is going to be kind of permanent in the country. So I think a lot depends also on the stability in a sense of migration within a country. But let me maybe put on my hat as kind of economist that has looked at social security, social insurance and social security more specifically. So the reading that my reading in a sense of the charts that were shown is that sort of pension design can also matter for the type of trends that we observe, especially in terms of the kind of contribution in a sense to aggregate labor supply. And I think a big difference, sort of at least in as far as I know, between the two countries, France and Germany, that we're looking at today, is that Germany has been progressively raising the normal retirement age and also has kind of limited exit routes earlier on, like before the normal retirement age. France, by contrast, has been sort of acting in terms of retirement policy a lot more on the financial incentives, essentially, to stay longer sort of in in work, and more generally, as we have seen, offers kind of higher replacement rate, more generous pensions. I think kind of these two elements, the normal retirement age, or in general, like statutory retirement ages, and the level of benefits, have been shown in the academic research to matter a lot for individuals' decision to remain in the labor force or kind of exit the labor force and retire. And in particular, the normal retirement age has been shown kind of to matter a lot, like to work very well to induce people to stay longer in the labor market. In what we label as income effects, so what would be driven by the generosity of pension, also matters, but with kind of potentially important distributional consequences that I would be happy to talk about later if you're interested.
Oh yeah, let's do that for sure. But I think for the moment, I'm going to turn to Antoine, perhaps first, because yes, indeed, Julia's work shows that this increase in the normal retirement age is very effective in keeping people longer in the labor market. On the other hand, somebody in the audience commented that, well, if you look at this chart that Hervé showed us, the range of employment rates that we saw at a similar normal retirement age, 65, is very wide. So there must be other levers as well, right? And perhaps you can comment on that, Antoine.
Yes, good morning, everyone. So I think there are two issues there. The first is that the normal retirement age doesn't mean the same thing in different pension systems. Why? Because they don't play a similar role. For instance, as Hervé was mentioning, in France, actually, what is really our normal retirement age is very hard to define. Why? Because we have an early retirement age, we have age with a full rate, and then we have the age with unconditional full rate. The unconditional full rate is 67, it's quite high, but that's not the age which matters most for most people, because most people will be able to have a full rate much earlier on. So the other things that Hervé alluded to is that there are other ways to retire early, typically special schemes. Hervé mentioned that. The other big type of policies that were implemented, for example, in France, were early retirement schemes, actually outside the pension system, which were implemented, for instance, in the late 70s and 80s in order to, at the time, we thought that we will solve unemployment by pushing all the workers out of the labor market. And when these schemes were closed in France in the mid-90s, this is when we see, as Hervé shown in his graph, the 55-59 employment rate went up in France very quickly. We closed these pathways for early retirement, and then employment at those age went up. I think this is a very good way to understand that actually, depending on countries, the normal retirement age might have very different impact on employment if you don't account for these other schemes or pathways for early retirement. In Germany, had early pathways for specific groups, for women, for long careers, and these were closed and had a very significant impact on the employment rate of older workers.
Thanks, Antoine. And maybe Ansel, to you now, because we were looking at old age employment rates, right? And mostly talking about and I'm sure it's strong, the impact of pension systems. But I understand, so this image that employment rates of older workers going up, you see that in many, many OECD countries. And sometimes I've heard that there are other factors at play as well, demographics, older workers now being more educated, etc. Would you say that the pension system is the prime force here, or are other forces at play as well?
Thanks a lot, Nicola. Yeah, I think first and foremost that we should use these different factors in combination, because this is what has the biggest power on increasing employment prospects of elderly people. I think pension definitely has an effect, but labor market policy also has an effect. And yes, it is also about higher academic rates. In Germany, it was also about a general labor market upswing. I think it was also in the presentation, and it was also about workers becoming scarcer and scarcer. So firms have been retaining workers longer because they knew, okay, I won't get any others if I let them go. All this has been factors. If I think about how to combine all that, we would need a perspective on, I would say, setting incentives instead of setting limits. So when I also look at the German pension debate, which is now heading towards a major pension reform, as we all know, we are talking very much about limits. So the one side wants to increase the age limits. The other side says, okay, but that's not fair. We have to recognize those who have many years of work. We should not overstrain workers in stressful jobs. Well, my proposal in that regard would be to say, let's not reward the people by lower pension age, but by higher pension claims. So we would have a minimum age, a uniform minimum age, and then talk about uniform supplements of, say, 0.5% per month that you go on working. And those who have many contribution years, like 40 or 45 or so, they could get extra supplements for that. So we would have a system that rewards going on working and does not talk about setting limits, since limits are, okay, they provide incentives, but they also set hurdles. And now I can come to labor market policy. Once you have such a perspective, for example, you can also install a systematic labor market policy which develops people further, especially those in stressful jobs, which are physically demanding, who cannot work until 67 or so. If you have a systematic policy developing them into related tasks with longer perspectives, and also thinking about qualification, which nobody has on the agenda for 50 plus, at the moment, then you get a totally different perspective. And then you can also say, okay, let's remove the hurdle of employment contracts, who usually automatically end at the statutory retirement age. We could simply say, okay, they automatically go on, but if it's desired, of course, they can be ended. That would switch the standard. So by that, really labor law and labor market policy and pension policies would go hand in hand, and I think that is what is important.
Thanks, Enzo. And we really have to come back also to the workers for whom it's more difficult to stay longer with Julia. But before we do that, Jérôme, I want to come to your study that you did with and for the Cour des Comptes, I think. So you were looking at pension reforms, and we already talked about it, about competitiveness. We saw that the tax wage in Germany is quite high, and somebody said in the commented in the chat that can impact on competitiveness, and pensions are discussed a lot regarding competitiveness in Germany. So yeah, I would just like to hear from you, what are the main results of this study? What is really the main message that we need to retain here for our discussion?
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you everyone, and really it's an honor to be part of such a panel. Indeed, it was not really a study, because we were really building upon the economic literature we have in France about retirement. And I think we had to answer two questions. And what is quite interesting is the questions that was raised by the politicians, I would say, so the government and part of the parliament. And Antoine alluded to that. There is still a very strong belief in France that if older people do not retire, then it will have an impact on unemployment, and you will have an increase of unemployment. And so I think it was the first question we had to answer, and it really makes also a link with what Enzo was saying about labor policies. And I think our task as Cour des Comptes was really to say that now we have very strong proof from the economic literature that when you're raising the retirement age, the result of that is that there are more employment in the society and not more unemployment. And so I think that was the first and important conclusion. But for Antoine, for example, or for people here, it was very well known. I think the government wanted the Cour des Comptes to say that. The other part, and you alluded to that, while we were asked, was to answer a very difficult question of the impact of the pension system on competitiveness. Why was it so difficult? The first part is that some people that are involved in the discussion about pensions raise the issues that competitiveness is not a very clear concept, and that the question was biased from the beginning. But more, I think, from my point of view, because I was leading the work on that report, was more that the difficulty here is that we all know the competitiveness of an economy is not depending on the pension system. It's more broadly social contribution and taxes that make your competitiveness, cost competitiveness. And so it's very difficult to say what the impact precisely of the pension system is on the competitiveness of an economy. And I think it will be also difficult for the German colleagues to answer this question in the new commission, because I don't think you can really say the pension system has this impact on the competitiveness. That's not true. You have to take it into consideration the whole fiscal system of a country. And so that's why at the end of the day, to answer this question, we just give some clues about where France was, some benchmarks, in particular in comparison with Germany, with Spain, Italy, what's the fiscal policy in terms of fiscal policy. And I think that was useful, but I don't think we have a very strong message on this part, except but Hervé shows that very well, is that there is a collective choice, and it's a very interesting question to know if it's a deliberate one or not in France to have very high expenses for retirement, for pensions. Mm-hmm. And that has an impact on competitiveness and on the whole fiscal system. And I think it was the only conclusion we could have at the end of the day.
Good to know. Sometimes I don't see Enzo. Now I don't see you, Jérôme. Maybe you can change that. But yeah, interesting to hear about this study. Before I move to Julia, I want to go to Hervé with a couple of some more technical and one perhaps political question that came up in the chat and regards your presentation. One is Silvia Sant'Angelo. She said, maybe you didn't get the normal retirement age right, but maybe it's because it's so difficult to define. In Italy, she says it's at 67. Maybe it was not for that time. Another person asked about the gender employment gap and asked whether it takes account of hours. I think you said it didn't. And then your third question, I'll remind you if you then forget, but that's an interesting and political one at this moment in Germany. I will be interested to hear whether it's in France as well, about the separate pension system for civil servants. Now discussed quite a bit. Should they be integrated into the general one? And you said it's rare for countries to have such a setup. Do we have OECD recommendations about it, or do we just say, well, that's a choice? It can have various effects depending on how these different systems are organized. So one is the normal retirement age in Italy.
Yes. I saw the chart. Maybe if it's okay, I can share again that slide with the retirement age, because that's where many questions fall, if you don't mind. Just 1 second.
Quickly, yeah. Yes, okay.
Because, so two things. No, in Italy, we didn't get it wrong. Yes, 67 is the statutory retirement age, but what we have here, the normal retirement age, is defined as the age where you can get, after a full career, a full pension, so pensions without penalty from all the different schemes that are mandatory. And for this chart, I use, so people retiring now, 2024, we use as an assumption of entry age at age 20. And in Italy, where is Italy there? In Italy, what is going on now is quota, I think was in 2024, quota 1, was it 103? It is quota measure, is that if you have, I don't remember the details, but something like 61 with 42 years, then you have access to full pensions without penalty. So that's why we have that reflects the quota. The question about gender. So first, before using that chart, there was also a question that why, when we have 65, all the countries with 65 here, there is a huge gap, huge differences in employment rate. And this is a very good question, of course, which shows that, of course, normal retirement age is partial and certainly does not explain everything. If I don't want to enter in all the details, but Belgium is typically one of the country where the measure is the most difficult, because in Belgium you have early retirement age without penalty. So in Belgium it's quite difficult to say what is the real normal retirement age
already. Yeah.
So it could be much lower actually. Mexico, I mentioned that in Latin America it's more complicated. New Zealand, here it's only the only mandatory scheme in New Zealand is residence-based basic pensions. Basically, you get it at 65. Everything is voluntary. So from voluntary pensions, you can get it very earlier age. Japan, the labor market for older workers is very different. This retirement age, you can have it, but you can have very bad working conditions much before, and so on. So that was the reason. The question about gender, yes, it's not taken into account. As I mentioned, it's only employment, but for those interested, I cannot resist. We just published Pensions at a Glance 2025 in December. And the main chapter there, chapter 2, is about the gender pension gap. And we take into account the impact of differences in working hours, in employment rate, and many different things, how it matters for total lifetime earnings, wage levels, and how it translates into pensions. So you can look at chapter 2 in Pensions at a Glance. And yes, and the last question about civil service pension. And here again, I'm sorry, I will share because that's easy. I prepared in the question, I prepared this, blah, blah, blah. Wait a second. I prepared.
Let's be brief. We don't have much time left, Hervé, but yes, it's great. Thanks.
Yeah, it's brief, but you'll see it's, I think, answering the question well, I think. Sorry. Yes. So that's an old publication, but it still works. So you see that here, that's the OECD countries, fully integrated schemes, separated. They have separate schemes, but in fact the same benefits. It's fully integrated, but there is a huge sometimes top up for civil servants, and that's the totally different scheme: Belgium, France, Germany, Korea. So two questions is first, how our countries done it. If you look at Portugal, Spain, Greece, that was mainly due to pressure from the global financial crisis that triggered. So you have the years where the reform took place. In Italy, it was in the building up in the euro adoption, basically constrained by fiscal pressure due to the Stability and Growth Pact rules, but there is a long phase in. And yes, Nicola, our recommendation tends to be that, of course, this generates a lot of inequality. Of course, as we know well in France, with the 2000, what it was, 19 reforms, it's complicated because, of course, for some civil servants, pensions is part of the overall contract. It's looked like a deferred wages in many ways. So it's complicated to reform. It can require a long phase in, but it's more. It looks more something of the past, and the OECD recommends as much as possible to take the time to try to harmonize, because this creates a lot of inefficiencies in the labor market. I stop.
Perfect. Thanks, Hervé. And now, Julia, we had several people saying yes, but if we we know that increasing retirement ages is very unpopular across the OECD, by the way, but perhaps most in France. I don't know. I don't know whether we have an indicator there where it's most unpopular. But in any case, it's a difficult reform to do. And what people mention and what's always discussed in that debate is that it will affect some workers more adversely than others. So I think the people in the chat said, well, for office workers, it's easier. Others have strenuous jobs. And you said you looked at this in particular for, I think your expertise is a bit on workers with lower skills, lower wages, etc. You looked at what higher pension ages does to them. So maybe you can share a bit your insights and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about also other people research more than mine, I guess. So yeah, it's definitely true. I mean, that raising the statutory retirement age tends to be somewhat unpopular. To be honest, I don't think, at least as far as I know academically, this popularity or not has been investigated deeply, but I saw statistics from YouGov, for example, highlighting this, this sort of unpopularity. That's probably because it seems like that, of course, there are benefits for society widely, but the costs of raising the statutory retirement age might seem rather concentrated in a sense, and definitely they have important distributional consequences. So of course, there are pockets, groups of workers that, due to being involved in strenuous jobs or being hit, for example, by shocks, health shocks, or other types of shocks, such as having to care for a family member or other types of circumstances, they might not be able basically to work until the statutory retirement age and the normal retirement age, let's see. So what can be done for these workers? Here, I think we should remind ourselves that pension systems are a kind of insurance schemes, but they also have kind of a redistributive component. And so, as they are in many countries, they have to be tailored in such a way that they can protect also the type of workers that cannot sort of easily reach working the normal retirement age. And so, obviously and this has been shown, for example, in work by Antoine very clearly for France and other countries, reforms that tend to penalize early retirement and reward later retirement have a regressive component, because typically it's people that are from, let me say, broadly speaking, lower socioeconomic status or backgrounds that tend to have to retire earlier. So of course there is a trade-off there between ensuring fiscal sustainability, fiscal consolidation, and retaining a degree of redistribution and equity that has to be balanced in deciding how to design pension systems. As Enzo was saying before, though, I believe there could be a role for thinking also about, here I'm thinking specifically about workers who might find their skills to become to some degree obsolete when they are in the middle of their careers. Here, I believe there is indeed a role for retraining policies where actually some concerted work between the social partners, firms, and work organizations might be particularly helpful in trying to design kind of this type of reskilling programs, but also in trying to direct workers towards maybe the sectors that are growing and that might be capable of re-employing kind of workers in the second half, let's say, of their careers.
Thanks a lot, Julia. And maybe since your work was mentioned, Antoine, I think I want to build on that a little bit on these ideas. And first, a little question, combine it with a little question I wonder about these different pension schemes. We heard the one for the civil servants and others, but you also mentioned that France has many. Sometimes because of the work was considered at least historically strenuous, so earlier retirement ages. I'm wondering whether these pension schemes make the different pension schemes make the labor market less flexible in the sense that people don't have incentives to switch out of a scheme that sort of allows them to retire earlier. And perhaps then in the second, building on what Julia just said, so you found out that increasing retirement ages can be regressive, and of course, there can be redistribution to make up for that. But what's the potential of ENSO's solution to say, okay, we retrain people, they change job. If it's strenuous in earlier ages, maybe they can do something else later on. Can that work? Has it worked in the past? That's what you can research. And do you think it could work in the future? After all, we are in a time of big structural changes in the economy and technology overall, right?
Right. Thank you for all these questions. So perhaps on the first point of the regressivity of using the tool of retirement age, I think one has to be a bit more precise. So the early retirement age, that is the age which is the binding age before which you cannot retire, will tend to be mostly the age where people we would like at all costs to retire, either because they have health issues or they are in a very, very difficult job. And when they can, they will retire. These tend to be people that have lower socioeconomic background. It means that when talking about retirement age, there is already a distinction between the sort of normal retirement age that is usually above an early retirement age, and what are the conditions to be able to claim an early retirement age. So having in the design of pensions something that combines, for example, an early retirement for people with health issues, disability, it's actually quite effective in allowing people who actually can't really work longer to retire early. The effect on employment will be very limited because the counterfactual is that they will not work in any way. Whereas and you can combine that with an increase in the normal retirement age, which then will affect actually a lot more people and will have a very big impact on employment, as Julia was mentioning. So I think to be a bit more precise than just using that catchword retirement age is very useful in thinking about the trade-offs. Yeah. And then there are cases that the issue of how do we deal with people who have difficulties or before even retirement age are not anymore on the labor market. And we know that there are as you approach retirement age, it's more and more difficult to actually from unemployment to go back to employment. Why? Because typically employers will not want to hire you if you are too close to actually being able to retire, and therefore the type of investment in recruiting someone so close to retirement age is difficult. I think when thinking about retraining, we need to think retraining not in a few years before retirement age. It's not for older workers. It's something earlier, because that will have bigger impact in the ability of those workers to actually stay longer in employment. And sometimes we only think, oh, we have a problem of older workers, then we need to have special training schemes for older workers. But in a sense, that's too late. It's something we need to think earlier on.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Antoine. And I'm going to move about the one about the inflation. Do different retirement schemes make the labor market?
Yeah, sorry, that was the other question you had. So it's very clear to me that So France has 52 different mandatory retirement schemes. 42, sorry. It's a lot. And it makes a lot of very complicated decisions for workers because you, depending on exactly your career, you will be impacted in different rules that provide you incentives to stay in your occupation because of better sort of pension arrangements or not. I think it's a problem for job-to-job mobility. It's a problem also, I think, for the type of retirement, progressive retirement, because typically with those very different schemes, it's a lot more difficult to allow people to have a progressive retirement, that is to progressively reduce the number of hours and increase the part on the pension. Why? Because typically they will have rules that you will lose a lot more of your pension if you actually decide to progressively reduce your hours of work. So I think there are sort of wide issues for both the labor market and for the retirement path to have this very complex set of pension schemes. But as we have seen in France, when there was a discussion to actually reduce this number of schemes and simplify considerably the system, there were a lot of, I'd say, angst on the part of the French workers to say, well, are they going to lose their special case, the way they are specially treated because of their occupation? And everybody was thinking there's going to be a loser.
Yeah.
And that was made the reform attempt in 2019 I think he failed to actually push in that direction, even though most people actually agree that they would prefer to have a simpler, more universal scheme, but then everyone is afraid that it will be at their detriment.
Yeah. Thanks. And I think it fits into a question that came about, well, in Sweden, there was big consensus. They managed to build big societal consensus about reform. Reforms in France are typically very disruptive and sometimes they take longer, but they do happen, we saw. So it's just perhaps a question of culture, but perhaps we'll come back to that question later. I do want to come to you, Enzo, because there were a lot of questions about, well, what I'm missing is the role of employers in wanting to retain older workers or keep them. I think, but I think the question is even more, and also about health and safety measures, ergonomic workplaces, which are important, I think. But I think in the current context, isn't the question even more complicated? Because we do have, well, now we see quite some labor shedding, after all, in Germany. And typically when large firms, in particular, when firms reduce their workforce, they resort a lot to early retirement, right? And I think what we see in many different countries in terms of increasing employment rates of older workers is mostly older workers staying in the job that they had. But changing jobs is much more complicated when you're older for many reasons. So will this change? And then you nodded when Antoine said, yeah, but acquiring skills is not for older workers. But what happens to these older workers who lose their job and should, and perhaps want to, find a new one, but are considered older workers? What's your solution there?
To be precise, I heavily nodded when Antoine said that acquiring skills should be an earlier task. We should not restrict it to the age of 60, because then in most cases we have to be
but if you're 60, honest, you can't go back in time.
In most cases, in the age of 60, it will be too late also for employers. That's to be realistic. It's something for the age of 50, but also in the age of 50, not many have it on the agenda, and therefore it's that important to have it systematically implemented in due time. That's extremely important. And what you mentioned now is also an extremely important point, since if we simply look at the statistics that also Hervé has shown in the beginning, all that what happened in Germany is pretty much a success story. So the employment rates increased a lot, really. But this is not what is currently happening, because in several years we are in a transformation. And there we see that indeed, ending jobs with early pension becomes more and more the usual thing now. And that's what people are used to from the past. Whenever you get into economic problems, you start moving out the elderly from the labor market with early pension systems, which are now not organized by the state, but by the firms themselves. And that's not the right direction at the moment. Therefore, what we also know, it's not only that it goes to early pension, but we also know is that in times of structural change, hysteresis effects are much stronger. We have a current study on that. So therefore, becoming unemployed now is especially difficult because the world goes by while you are in long-term unemployed. Therefore, we really need a systematic policy that enables people who have long-standing experience in their jobs to switch to other jobs. But the good thing is, it's not necessary to switch to totally different occupations. So we all know that in the age of 58, almost nobody will learn a totally different occupation. But it's important to go to different applications. So when you look, for example, at manufacturing, which is so much under fire at the moment in Germany, then there are so many options in renewable energies and other sectors where these technical skills are needed in general, like machine building, like electrics and so on, but where you have different applications. Therefore, we need to create something like packages with good counseling services, with good matching services, with very targeted qualification and training services, not like 2 years different occupation, but maybe a few months. We need to build networks with labor market policy and the firms on board who have the responsibility. And we should have some financial support. For example, if you leave your job and get a severance pay, we could say for each and every year that you continue working in another job, you get 1/5 of this severance pay tax-free. That would be an incentive really to take this route, and it would also be a support to go through a certain dampening of the wage level until you have developed further and the job has developed further.
I have to follow up because I mean, isn't there, because what we're seeing right now, the big firms in Germany downsizing and as the person said, well, I don't know whether they said it, but it's a lot with early retirement schemes or big severance packages. And I think sometimes the workers who are put on these severance packages, they're not even allowed by the agreement to work somewhere else. So don't we need policies that change incentives for employers here too? Because well, in part they're giving severance pay, but in part they're also using the retirement schemes to basically get rid of workers, what they say is a sort of a more social way of doing it.
Yeah, usually that's a combination. And for example, this tax-free arrangement, it would help the employers and it would help the employees. And it would also help other employers who are really in need of workers. Since what we see at the moment is in the same occupations where unemployment is rising now, you have the scarcity of labor in general. Mm-hmm. And that's a really critical situation. We know that from Hervé's presentation that we will have demographic shrinkage. So we should really not make the same mistakes we made in the 90s. We are in a different situation. We need the workforce, and further development would be extremely important. But in order not to blame everything on the employers, what we also see already before COVID was that employers took more and more action in order to retain the elderly workers. And when you look at what they have done when they wanted to retain people who already were able to go to the pension system, it was not so much putting money on the table. It was offering flexible working times, and it was offering adequate roles. So they offered something that was appropriate for this phase of lifetime of these people. And that is also something from employer side that should be considered now in this situation.
Thanks, Enzo. And I see we are already past our time, but I'm going just to go do some overtime. If I hope you can do that. Jérôme, perhaps for you, I mean, the study that you presented was also to inform the public, to show, right, increased pension ages, as you said, are not associated with higher unemployment, rather with more employment. But I want to come back perhaps to this question about Sweden and how do they do this, that they create this big consensus. Do you think there's something for France and Germany to learn there? France in particular, where we sometimes see very vive débat. So so it's, people perhaps agree to some reform, like unifying, having a simpler system in principle, but then get very upset because they don't understand what will the reform do to me. Is there ways? I mean, Sweden is special, right, with the consensus between the government, trade unions, employer associations, but can something be learned from there?
Yes, thank you. And maybe I will come back also to this question of regressivity and early retirement, just in one word. I think, and Julia mentioned it, question if there were studies about the cultural acceptance of reforming the pension schemes all over Europe. We were looking for that, and I think there are some studies that are ongoing now, teams, especially in France. But what we see is the result of Eurostat. And I think we mentioned that in the report, is that in France, the people want to go in retirement very early and really earlier than the rest of Europe. And that's really specific to France. And I think this makes a great difference even with Italy, with Spain, with Germany. We do compare a lot with those three countries and not really with Sweden. And I think that can explain why it's so difficult in France to speak about retirement and to have a fact-based debate on retirement and on pensions. And maybe one other element is that it was a very political decision in 1981 to have the retirement with 60, a very important measure from Mitterrand. And I think it can explain that in France, everyone has in mind this 60-year thing and want to go in retirement with 60. Mm-hmm. And we don't have any consensus about, yes, but now you're living longer, so we can't afford to have everyone going into retirement with 60. But really, when you look at Eurostat, you will see the difference between France and the rest of Europe, because even when the people can work longer, they don't want to. Mm-hmm. And which leads me to the other question about people in difficult jobs. So this was a huge debate in France with, at the end of the day, this scheme for people with difficult jobs. But what we found is that it's missing the aim of the scheme, because the people who are benefiting from this scheme are people with average pensions. And the poorer ones, but really a lot of the poor people that want to go in retirement have to wait until, in France, the age for the full pension is 65. And those people, the poorest one, have to wait until 65. And why is that? It's because these workers, they don't have the 42 years of working. They have been working, not working, unemployment. And so the poorest people are not benefiting from those schemes. And I really concur with Enzo. I really think and it's what studies are now showing, is that it's really difficult to have pension schemes on early retirement for people with difficult jobs. Mm-hmm. And it's really more efficient to think about something around part-time job, because people are willing to stay want to be part-time, and sometimes difficult. Formation, discrimination, because we know we have some discrimination. And that also is very French. The older people don't want to have lower salaries when they are older. And that's an issue. And there, the state can come and complement what they are earning in order for them to accept from their employees a cut in what they are earning, because we see in the rest of Europe, older people are earning a little bit less than, I don't know, people with 50. And it's not the case in France. In France, really, people with 60 want very high pay, and then they go into trouble because the companies don't want to. And so I think it's more around that the state should come with solutions, and not really with early retirement schemes, because we have seen in the past that it's really, really difficult to calibrate, at least in France.
Thank you, Jérôme. And now I have little questions to Julia and Antoine after you talked. But Julia, just about this, to come back to our worker with difficult working lives and perhaps precarious or on and off jobs, etc. What can be done for them? Because that's a bit your expertise. So we heard, and you already said, there could be transfers, right? Some support. But also we talked a lot about skills, training when you're older. I think, so we talk a lot about that, but I don't think we've seen a lot about it up to now. And in particular, of course, for lower skilled workers. I don't know whether you've looked into this, but what can be done from the employer side, or perhaps also from the public policy side, to make this possible?
So yeah, I must say, actually, it's not a topic that I've researched directly myself, and so I can tell you about my knowledge, kind of the literature there.
Sure, that's excellent knowledge.
So kind of my, or maybe let me give you my view of maybe what can work. I think, as Antoine was saying, I think it's somewhat difficult to think about like retraining individuals again that are very close, let's say, or relatively close, kind of to the retirement age, broadly speaking, whether it's the early or the normal retirement age. I think there could be scope, especially, to provide information maybe to these people about where to direct potentially their search, to support kind of employers and coordinate employers in order to design maybe some kind of forms of retraining that could work for these workers and could potentially be supported also by the state. But I think potentially, I mean, redirecting workers towards the right opportunity, might work. To be honest, like, I'm not really like aware of, or maybe it's kind of just that I don't really know much about research that has looked at the effectiveness of this type of programs. I said it before, maybe I would like to iterate it. And again, I agree. I think Antoine put it probably much better than I did. Retirement schemes also have kind of an insurance role, in the sense that they're there also to insure and redistribute towards people that, for whatever reason, different reasons, cannot work kind of in older ages. So I think we should, at the same time, yes, think about how we can improve fiscal consolidation, but not forget that kind of pension schemes are also there to tackle kind of this type of situations.
Yes, thanks. And Antoine, now my last question to you, because it's sort of when Jérôme said, but the French, they always want to retire very early. I remember that it's something I heard in Austria too. And at the same time, so surveys among people, but I don't know whether it was a representative survey, but it was a person basically looking into retirement and also life simply of more workers with lower skills, lower incomes, etc. He said, but the moment it comes, people, after some time, people realize, well, that's boring. I would like to do, it's a long time for many people to be in retirement when you retire at 60 or even 65 nowadays. So my question to you is, are you aware of service? Do they sometimes look at people when they're already retired? Are they happy retirees? And, you know, is there room to bring in some more flexibility so that you can do, no, it doesn't have to be full-time employment, right? But that you can do some things while you're retired. Is there scope there just to have a more interesting, active life when you're older, when you're past retirement age?
So Jérôme alluded to the fact that there's been studies where you ask people when you want to retire, and in France they say as soon as possible.
Now,
but what I would qualify that type of response to surveys that when these same people in France are facing a schedule when you say you get the full rate, but it's 1 year later, or you get a penalty, then they get for the full rate. They work longer. They respond to the type of incentives that is embedded. They respond more to something that is more salient, as the work with Julia and the book in the CPR was showed that the more clear the type of incentives in the pension system, they tend to respond to that. So the fact that they're saying, I want to retire early, to me is not completely a sign that they will not respond to change in the pension systems and incentives. Once, I think I'm very in favor of actually more flexibility for people to actually retire partly, retire fully, and de-retire. And I think this is something I find very attractive in the Swedish model, where you can have a very sort of the change of your pension right can be, you can claim your pension right, but then declaim part of it, declaim it fully, because there's some evidence more and more in many countries where people do retire and then come back to the labor market after 1 year, sometimes 2 years, but people have remorse. They regret, they say, oh, maybe, and then I should go back, and they go back for different types of, and that's, I think, a very good thing that should be encouraged. For too long, we have understood the retirement as a definitive decision then until the rest of your life, whereas it can be something more as a transition towards full retirement, where you can actually decide to retire and decide then to de-retire, to work part-time. And I think that would be, to encourage that, will make it more flexible, and also it will have very positive effect on the welfare of people, which I think is
because you don't know what it's like to be retired before you do it, right? And one last question to have, at least because Lila had a very good set of questions. I don't think I did any justice to it. But one question that's important there perhaps is, do people want to retire so early? Do you think? I don't know whether you have empirical insights. Also because there's a lack of managerial practices, ergonomics, etc., health considerations for older workers in the job. In other words, is there more of a role for employers to make it more attractive to stay beyond the financial systems, incentives that come from the pension schemes?
So I think the evidence we have is in France, people in the labor market generally, in the relationship with their in their firm, they are much less happy in the way they are treated as a worker than in other European countries, which I think is one part, also could be one part of the explanation of why you want to retire early. So I think there is something which is a bit, I mean, it's much more difficult for governments to influence actually how, workers, managerial practices within firm than changing the pension system. But I think it's part of the wider element of, if you have employers who care a lot about the welfare of your workers to be happy at work, then you want more. It's a lot easier to continue to have longer career than if something where you suffer a lot at work and you want to end it as soon as possible.
Brilliant. So I made you work, the audience, I made them work a little bit longer than we had anticipated, but I thought it was so interesting, and people were free to leave anyway. So thank you very much to my brilliant panel, Julia, Antoine, Jérôme, and Enzo. Thank you, Hervé, for the great introduction and further explanations. And thanks also to the audience that was instrumental in making this an interesting discussion. And I hope we'll be back in terms of, bringing the Franco-German economic agenda to life. Have a nice day and retire flexibly.